Welcome to Urban Grown Stories, the companion podcast for the Urban Grown Tour hosted by Cultivate KC. You will hear from urban farmers, growers, and advocates across the Kansas City metro area. From the history of local food in KC to the challenges new farmers face and the impactful ways you can get involved in our local food system, this story collection will leave you inspired, informed, and hungry for change.
In this episode, we visit Juniper Gardens Training Farm to hear from Ben. This is their story.
Editor's note. Since the recording of this episode, Catholic Charities of Northeast Kansas has made the difficult decision to end their involvement in the New Roots program at the end of the 2025 growing season. This is due to the illegal termination of a USDA grant supporting the program, along with the loss of nearly $5 million in support of the refugee resettlement services at the direction of the Trump administration. Cultivate KC is committed to the continuation of Juniper Gardens Training Farm and the New Roots program.
So my name is Ben Carpenter. I'm the program manager at Juniper Gardens Training Farm. As the manager, mostly I see my role as making sure that the staff have what they need in order to get their job done with the programming. As a training farm, folks have a lot of educational materials and farming needs. We have 17 growers on site who are growing for production, and then we have 27 community gardeners, so play a big role in communicating with them, coordinating community garden. I don't know if I actually could talk about all the hats that we're in. For folks who are not familiar, so Juniper Gardens Training Farm hosts the New Roots program. They're pretty closely tied together. The New Roots program is a training program, 4-year training program for refugees and immigrants who have an agricultural background and they'd like to start farm businesses in the United States. It's co-managed 50-50 with Catholic Charities of Northeast Kansas. And it's been around, we've been growing here at Juniper Gardens since 2008. So over the course of 4 years, folks are provided with about a 1/4 acre of land that they can manage how they want, how they see fit. They can experiment, they learn, and they grow, right? But, we also do a ton of educational programming outside of the actual opportunities that people have to experiment. We have a farm class series through the wintertime that basically it teaches folks everything you need to know about growing and selling in the United States, which, as you might imagine, is a little bit different from growing on the equator. Like I said, we're in our 17th growing season, and the folks, it's become more than a training farm in many ways. It is also kind of a hub and a resource for many of the folks in these communities. Well, a significant portion of our curriculum revolves around season extension. A lot of folks are from countries on the equator, and so just a longer growing season means that they're used to growing different kinds of crops. So we spend a lot of time talking about how to use shade cloth or kind of get the most out of those shoulder seasons in the spring and fall. And the sort of climate resilience agriculture framework kind of underlines most of our curriculum. So not just talking about season extension, but talking about how to adapt to long periods of unpredictable weather. Really, we have a greenhouse, a brand new greenhouse, the Diana Eisman Community Greenhouse that the program has been fortunate enough to use this season. And for a lot of people, from Southeast Asia or Equatorial Africa, generally aren't familiar with what a greenhouse is or why to use it. The folks in this program certainly do. It's one of the first classes that we teach. But that's sort of, I think, like a visible, physical symbol of some of our stuff. So I'm from upstate New York, right, by Buffalo, and we have a comparatively short growing season, even compared to Missouri and Kansas. The benefit for production farmers is to be the first at market when the spring comes with the most variety. There's other benefits, if you can grow longer into the fall, you have more fresh food available for your family, which a lot of folks here grow for their families and their communities. But that's the main one. That's the main angle that we teach, is that if you can have crops ready for day one of your farmer's market or day one of the CSA, you're going to have a leg up on the competition. Catholic Charities staff, one, they run our aggregated CSA, our farm share, but they also teach the business and marketing classes. Folks, around the world purchase and grow vegetables much differently than Americans do. The Americans tend to buy just enough produce for like a single recipe. A lot of the people from the countries where the New Roots farmers are from will buy like a ton of vegetables at the time. And they'll usually store it, they'll dry it out, or to have on hand. So a lot of our classes talk about what are American consumers looking for when they go to the farmers market. How do they like to see it presented? How do you interact with a customer in order to one, gain their trust, but then also convince them that your produce is your carrot's better than all the other carrots at the farmers market, right? So we have three main sales channels that the New Roots farmers have available to them, and that are part of the training process. It gets people used to, kind of ideally when they graduate, striking out on their own, building their own client lists. First one is the farmers market. It's probably the one that most people are familiar with. We have farmers in training or graduates at most, if not all, of the farmers markets in the metro. So if you've been to a farmer's market in Kansas City, you've probably at least walked past a New Roots farmer. Maybe even purchased from. The fact is, the farmers markets tend to not be as profitable, just after the amount of time that goes into labor and harvesting and washing and packing, spending the time at the farmers market. And so we do sort of frame that, or we've started kind of frame farmers markets, the value of farmers markets for the farmer, in terms of an opportunity to like market their farms and market their CSAs and market their wholesale offerings. Really kind of emphasize the need to build relationships with customers. Our CSA and our wholesale online ordering programs tend to be like a little bit more revenue generating. And I think that's probably true of most small farms. So the CSA, with folks, it's a pretty hard thing to really teach in a plain language way. It requires so much consistency. But what we do is essentially purchase individual like bunches of crops or whatever from farmers at Juniper Gardens and some graduates, and then we have them aggregate it here at our wash stand. And the Catholic Charities staff package it up and ship it out. And the same thing goes with the wholesale orders. So we sell to a number of restaurants in the area. Historically, we've sold to schools and hotels, but that one is probably, besides farmers market, the sales channel that we do the most education on and around. There's the Catholic Charities staff, and along with the Cultivate KC education staff, coordinate field trips and chef visits. So they'll go to Town Company and meet Johnny Leach, get to see how he uses their produce. Or we'll have, kind of related to that, we worked last year with Fair Share Farms to develop like a New Roots branded kimchi. So the good folks up there who are big friends of the program, they contracted like a specific amount of bok choy before it had been grown, which is like, again, American growers are probably used to that sort of model, but it was a new format for the farmers. And it was a pretty good success. People had a really meaningful time with that, I think. They made some money, but they also got really excited about the idea of contracts, which, again, we're probably used to. A lot of folks, American-born folks, are probably used to it, but it's a novel concept sometimes. So, like the farmers here, especially, they do grow a lot of crops that maybe just aren't that familiar to American consumers, and so we actually, in one of the sheds over here, we have like a wall full of recipe cards that farmers can use to bring to their markets and kind of share with customers if for produce that American consumers are probably unfamiliar with, like chinbong or machicha or isogo. That tells folks how to use it. So as far as being willing to experiment, I think at farmers markets is like maybe one of the beauties of like kind of those public spaces. You just get to see so much variety that you definitely won't be able to find at like a Hy-Vee or something like that. I think something else that we don't really talk about it explicitly as far as like the programming goes, but like one of the reasons that we grow, we talk about sort of mixed crop, sort of intensive cultivation here, right? They're relatively small spaces with like a ton of variety in them. I think there's something like 72 different crops at least grown here, and that's partly because this is similar to the size of space that folks will probably be growing on when they leave the program. Two, it's also climate resilient to have variety, but also in order to survive as like a small farm, you need to really focus on crops that aren't easily mechanized or aren't easily scaled. And so things like strawberries or kale, or I'm trying to think of tomatoes aren't like super easy to mechanize those kinds of things, and really like being able to identify what I can reliably find at the farmer's market, what is actually making the small farmer money versus like looking for potatoes and then being disappointed that you can't find potatoes. I think that's another important kind of approach. There are some things that are just like super easy to, like corn, right? Like you will probably always be able to find corn like way cheaper at the grocery store than you will at a farmer's market, partly because they can produce it at economies of scale much greater. And so if you like sort of go to the grocery store for those kinds of products and then expect to go to the farmer's market and find just those other sort of other value added goods, more specialty crops, I think that's a good shopping strategy for folks who want to maximize the farmer's market. And I say that because, like, from my personal experience, as someone who, I've worked on and around farms and farmers markets and sustainability circles for like last, 13 years, I have been historically discouraged, like going to the farmer's market without a plan or having a grocery list of things that like I now know, like just you won't find at a farmer's market, or you could find much cheaper. So I think like having that strategy like helps a person from being discouraged on their Saturdays at farmer's market. Climate resilience is something that not just farmers have to take into consideration, obviously, but that we take pretty seriously here. Diversity is really important to a farmer of any scale because, when you have unpredictable insect populations, like kind of fluctuate like wildly year to year in ways that are, like probably a little bit exacerbated. It really like, if you have or harlequin beetles like knock out all of your kale and you don't have anything else that you can take to market, then you're just kind of out that money, But if you have like kale and, tomatoes and peppers and jinbong and okra, it puts more options for revenue on your table in the event that something happens to one of those crops. It could be insects, it could be, a drought, like there's, tomatoes won't fruit if it's like over a certain temperature for an extended period of time, which we've seen in recent years. So really diversifying, like you would a stock portfolio, right? Like you diversify your holdings to make sure that you can manage that risk. The scale, I think, is something slightly like less, it's just more like socially oriented. It's more of a social analytic thing. The scale that, again, I mentioned that the quarter acre is roughly, it's more realistic in terms of preparing people for the amount of land that they'll be able to find in Wyandotte County after they graduate. And a lot of folks want to stay in Wyandotte County. It's where their families are, it's where their communities are, it's where a lot of social services are. And so moving out into rural parts where there might be more acreage is just not usually a feasible thing or even a desirable thing for some of these families. And so in order to facilitate that access to like growing marketable produce in a way that supplements a household's income or supplements their diet means getting people used to like this scale, showing not only that it's doable, but that you can actually make some good money. Another thing, that was, when I first learned about the New Roots program years ago, I was super skeptical of urban farming in general, gardening, about the ability to produce an amazing amount of food affordably for an urban population. And since my time with New Roots, that's definitely changed. We have about 9 acres here, and on average, the farm will produce about $150,000 of produce a year. And all of that stays with the farmers, right? It's each plot will generally produce by itself, varying amounts of revenue, but it's just like it's much more money than I expected from such a small area. And part of it's the reason that happens is because the folks who grow here are just kind of used to doing that. Not just growing in a small area, but like being really resourceful with what they have on hand. So, if you put any sort of limits around them, they just flourish within those limits, right? They do really well when given what they have. So there's not a lot of land. There's not a lot of land zoned in ways that's conducive of growing food, but the land that we can find is pretty expensive too. So land access making sure, sometimes folks are generous enough to, like Melissa from Lulu's, helped us sort of found the Troop Orchard around the corner by facilitating, purchasing a plot of land nearby so that we could do programming that we aren't able to do here because we don't own the space. And so land access is pretty big for the program as well as the farmers as they leave. Part of the program in years 3 and 4 is, working with a graduate support specialist to identify land in Wyandotte County or like kind of the surrounding area to lease or own on your own, right? And that worked pretty well. That model has also been challenged by increased property prices in Wyandotte County, especially. And so what we've actually had to end up doing is, we lease now to graduates here on site in order to provide like a little bit more of a bridge between leaving the program and then, actually getting shovel in the ground on their own site. I know we were looking for a larger graduate farm in West Wyandotte for various federal funding related reasons. That's sort of on hold at the moment. But land access is pretty big. Zoning, our graduates especially, not so much us. Because we've been around for so long, we have a pretty good relationship with the unified government. But zoning is still an issue, right? Special use permits are needed for any structure over 100 square feet or something like that. So everything you see around you here, we have probably almost a dozen outbuildings, requires a special use permit. It's like sort of this months-long process to go through the commission. And so when people are starting their farm, it's often, they'll find a place to lease or to even buy in Wyandotte County. But if it's not zoned anything other than ag, it's like an incredible challenge to get anything like a shed put on your farm. And so zoning laws kind of a pretty big barrier. Language access is really a pretty big blind spot when it comes to a lot of federal funding, especially, or really any funding, or programs that help connect people with the resources that they need to develop the infrastructure on their farm, get water on their farm, build wash stands, find customers. If it's all in English, right, and if you don't speak English, then functionally it doesn't exist. And this is not, the New Roots farmers, we in many ways provide that interface when we can't develop like sort of a parallel tool in their own language with people who hold resources. But I think it would be a tremendous benefit to like the entire community if more language access was written into budgets for grants, and if local municipalities made like zoning processes like more transparent, like in English. That needs to happen, right? They're pretty opaque right now, or convoluted and hard to understand. But if you don't speak English, like you are up the creek without a paddle, So I think those are pretty big things. So programs like Juniper, incubator farms for refugees and immigrants. We're not the only one. There's dozens around the country. We work with them pretty actively, and they all rely pretty heavily on federal funding, which is a little shaky right now. And so, I think something that listeners could do, is, considering the acute vulnerability of not only programs like this, but the people who participate in the programs. Just consider that, like when given the selection of like produce sources, instead of, maybe shopping at Hy-Vee, maybe like seeking out a New Roots farmer at one of the farmers markets. Maybe purchasing a farm share CSA for the summer. Those go a long way to not just, the sales ends of things like directly support the farmers. So it's less about supporting the program itself, but it's what will convince the farmer that it is a viable path forward for themselves. If they can demonstrate to themselves that they make as much money, growing food as they do like working at Amazon, in a way that's like it also connects them to their traditions. It keeps their heritages close when those lines have been cut. And so it's not just supporting like a local farmer, like you're actively cultivating a community in which people are allowed to maintain a sense of self that they grew up with, that is still important to them, and that can be really traumatizing to have to leave behind. So I think supporting, like, of course, any BIPOC farmers, farmers who don't speak English, farmers who are just new Americans. I think that's looking at the current climate politically and sort of like just trying to see how to kind of make it a little bit nicer and more welcoming of a place. I mean, Juniper Gardens by itself, like I this is obviously my job, but like I actually spend probably more free time than is healthy here, just because it is such like a genuinely happy place, especially like when the season's going. You know, you have dozens of families here. You know, grandparents, children, aunts and uncles, like people just like hanging out and like kind of just treating it like a place where they can feel safe, where they can relax and kind of commune. So I think like there's a lot to look at here on this farm that is encouraging, and it's all related to that. You know, so for example, so recently in the apartment buildings surrounding the farm, you had a few new families resettled at the end of 2024 from Southeast Asia and Central Africa, who were then sort of left without caseworkers when an executive order basically just stopped all casework for new arrivals. And so, I mean, it was really hard to watch. Just families without caseworkers who don't know the language, don't know how to work the bus system, not really sure how to navigate food assistance, stuff like that. But what was like sort of equally as heartening and like just heartbreakingly beautiful was watching like the New Roots farmers immediately recognize the situation and like immediately make connections with these families who they had never met before, right? But they had recognized the situation that they were going through and immediately invited people to their churches, invited people to homes. It was a situation where like everything felt very bad, but then watching like these connections happen and these families who like share this space thrive and like laugh as if like nothing's happening just shows me that whatever the last has happened like recently, the last 17 years have like built a physical space where people can hang out and be themselves, but also they built really robust networks in communities that have now like it makes Kansas City a little bit more of a cohesive place, I think. And and at the same time, it like provides communities again with culturally relevant food. There's some of the crops that we grow here. People will come from like other states to like buy it by the garbage bag full, and so like that is so cool to me, and that's why I think programs like so important. Not just because it's like an educational program where people start businesses or whatever, but it's like it's become something different that I don't know how to articulate. It's a facilitator of belonging. It's a facilitator of stability in communities where stability has been sorely lacking. And so I think that's heartening, and I really would like to see that continue. We are on Facebook and Instagram, New Roots KC, and that's generally where we promote a lot of our events, our public events that we have throughout the year. They allow people from the public, whether they're volunteers or they're just interested in the program, to come check out the farm. We have our homegrown happy hour that's usually in July, but it's a good time. There's music, there's food, usually from local restaurants, and we have a harvest potluck at the end of the summer that sort of kind of culminates. It's sort of a last hurrah for the season where folks can come out and kind of do the same thing. We also have farm share CSA. Again, that's a pretty substantial chunk of the farmer's income. And then volunteer. We are always in need of volunteers who can come, work with a farmer in their field or accompany them to markets on, Saturday mornings. The first years, volunteers really help build that confidence the first years, for whom sometimes it's the first farmer's market they've been to. And it's just helping negotiate interactions with English-speaking customers. The final and probably most important ask is land. We talked about land access earlier. We've had folks who have learned about the program, people whose maybe an uncle owned 4 acres somewhere, who recently passed away, or they wanted the land to go to good use, and then they were able to lease it to New Roots farmers. So we're always looking for land access opportunities for the growers, and then we ourselves are always looking for land. I mentioned the graduate farm aspirations earlier, and we'd really like to see that come to fruition. So if you got a line on land, let us know.
Food for thought. How can you help support your local food system? Start with buying local through CSAs or your local farmers market. Volunteer at your local growing space, cultivate your own food, or voice your support of urban growing to your elected officials. Visit cultivatekc.org/ Urban Grown Stories for more information. For more on the growing site featured in today's episode, please check the show notes. Thank you for listening to Urban Grown Stories, a podcast brought to you by Cultivate KC in partnership with KC BizCare. Urban Grown Stories is hosted and produced by Jessica Garcia, with interviews recorded and edited by Kara Harpstreet, a Kansas Local Food Fellow with K-State Research and Extension. Production and editing support from Eric Hemphill and Ami Freeberg, with intros provided by Cultivate KC staff. Keep growing, Kansas City!